I don't see anybody here for public participation, so we can move right on. The genesis of this meeting was Melissa Tentakoulis from the Economic Development Office reaching out and asking if we would give some time to review the financial analysis of her proposed zoning for the district and the mall area. And so she's brought their consultants. I'll let you introduce them. They're going to do a presentation, and then we'll have a question and answer. Melissa, go ahead.
Thank you, Chair Davidson. For the record, my name is Melissa Tentakoulis. I work as the Economic Development Director. And thank you all for your time in assembling for the review of the fiscal impact analysis that you'll hear. I just wanted to recognize the consultant team Landwise, Amy Fader and John Terramizzo. They have been instrumental on, helping us kind of analyze and look at a proposal that you'll be hearing in January. So as many of you know, about 2 years ago, we started looking at the commercial district and looking at how we can remain competitive, relevant, and sustain value over time in our core engine, which is the Mall Road and Middlesex Turnpike. And a lot of that ended up looking at land uses, current development capacity, and what's possible if you change land use policies. Looking at market preferences, looking at developer interests, looking at what the community wants is kind of the process that we've been going through in the last couple of years. Several of you know you've been on the advisory group committee, which has been kind of a sounding board up until probably about 6 to 8 months ago of developing the policy. And today, what I'd like this group to do, whereas a lot of the land use policies kind of, the realm is planning board, ZBRC, and the land use committee for a town meeting, I think Ways and Means has a real integral part of this because, as you know, the development and the commercial values, residential, the impacts of residential uses is kind of part and parcel of what our community pays for and how we generate money. So part of this analysis is like, okay, if we do change the land use policies here, how will that affect us? And can we sustain it? And does it allow the type of growth we want to see? And with that, we wanted to take a kind of deeper dive. We were able to secure funding through the state to get a grant that really allowed us to hire Landwise and do the deeper dive, which is the fiscal impact analysis. So in January, town meeting will consider the phase 1 of a two-phase proposal. And we'll go into that. I think what I'd like to do is try to share a PowerPoint. We'll have Amy and John run through it. Let me see if this works. Does that work? There we go. So I am trying to pull up this here, and so I can give you some context for the area we're looking at. Does that make, can you see it all? Maybe that guy, presentation.
That's better.
Okay. Then. So they're going to go through their analysis, but I wanted to just to bring you here to this page. This page kind of gives you a sense in the map of what we're looking at. When I say phase 1 and phase 2, the zoning that you'll hear about on January is going to be the dark pink area. Which encompasses about 12 parcels. They're large parcels, but it's just about 12 parcels. And then the pink is a phase 2. But Amy and John had looked at the whole, so pink, the dark pink and the light pink in this analysis. And I just wanted to make that clear as we kind of start this out. And with that, I think I'll turn it over to you guys, and then we'll have the presentation, and then we can answer or go through some questions and answers more specifically. How's that?
Okay, that's good. Thank you. So hi, everyone. I'm Amy Fader. I'm a planner with Landwise, and I'm joined by John Tremendazzi, the principal here. And I We've worked in Burlington before, so in 2021, 22, we were involved in the Burlington 128 district plan, and so we've been working with Melissa as well as several town staff to gather sort of input into the methodologies here and the analysis that we've been doing. So the presentation's organized into 3 sections. I'll do a sort of an introduction about, the market context, why mixed-use zoning, and try to relate the mixed-use zoning to other development areas in town. So far, there's not been a lot of vertical mixed use, but there's been horizontal mixed use in the area around 3rd Ave. So we'll do a little case study about that and look at sort of value growth over time. The fiscal analysis that we go into is really in today's dollars, and so it's important to think about, what's happening over, the next few years, what happens annually, but it's also important to think about long-term value growth, so that's why we've included that. The second section is an overview of sort of the town budget and our methodology, the parcels included in the rezoning, looking at market demand for new development, and some assumptions that are baked into our model. So this is, a rezoning, and there's a lot of assumptions that we have to make about the pace of development going forward. And then the third section is a fiscal impact summary that compares net positive revenue between existing zoning today and then future mixed-use zoning, and some observations about that. The appendix includes a series of tables that back the summary table. So those are specific to, things like schools, public works, and I'm happy to answer questions about those tables if there's things that piqued your interest. In terms of the market, we know the office market since the pandemic has been weakened, and there's quite a bit of research out there that talks about how vacancy rates are higher in sort of single-use office districts, and mixed-use districts are seeing much lower vacancy rates. So the map on screen was produced by CBRE, and it shows the Boston metro region. And when you see these green sort of hot spots, this is what CBRE is calling vibrant mixed-use districts. And they're saying that vibrant mixed-use districts have a 14% average vacancy rate, where Boston as a whole is 17%. For Burlington, you are often categorized in the Route 28, 128 North district, and so the last quarter, the vacancy rate for that whole region was about 18%. There's figures that suggest Burlington's probably a little bit less than that, but just some context about why we're thinking about mixed use in the office market. So the zoning map on the left includes the zoning districts that are there today. You will see that there's a district called PDD, which is Planned Development District, and so land areas of 10 or more acres can basically submit Planned Development District what's the word for it, designation, or go through a zoning process where they're writing their own zoning. And so you'll see that the PDD area is not included in the rezoning on the right. That's left out. The BG and the IG, which are business and industrial districts, as well as the I, the innovation districts, those are included in the rezoning to a mixed-use zone. Those districts do not permit residential today. So in thinking about where else there's been mixed use, when I say horizontal mixed use, I'm saying that, there's not stacked vertical mixed use development, but this area around 3rd Avenue has seen, a mix of uses that, makes it a little bit more walkable, that introduces, residential adjacent to employment space. And so the map on the left shows that in 2005, a majority of parcels, were bringing in tax revenue of less than $75,000. That's in 2005 dollars. And then on the right, when you see, several of these parcels have seen redevelopment over time, the tax revenue has really substantially grown. And so we brought the 2005 numbers up to 2024 numbers using a factor that the town had supplied us with. And you can really see that tax revenue for that area basically doubled within 2 decades. So while we're going to be talking about current year, today's numbers, this is important to think about just for the future. In terms of laying the context for this analysis, we reviewed the town's budget for fiscal year ⁻25. We know that the budget is primarily made up of local property tax, right? 76% of general fund revenues come from that, with the majority coming from commercial properties, which are taxed at a higher rate. On the expense side, we know that you have a large wedge of the pie there that's accommodated accounts. I think for this purpose, when you think about new development, population growth, actually factoring up accommodated accounts, which includes some of your umbrella things like employee benefits, that's really hard to do. So that category is not included in the expenses going forward, but the other large wedges, general government and education, are included. So again, all revenues and costs are reported in current dollars, and we're primarily using what's called an average costing method or a per capita method to look at growth going forward, with new development. Just to give you an overview of the district, the dashed outline represents the perimeter of the area to be rezoned. You'll see that a large portion of the uses are general office and banks, and then commercial and retail. There's 1 residential facility today and 3 hotels. And then when you look at the tax rates for this area, it's really primarily commercial except for that 1 residential facility. There's also a lot of land around the hospital that's tax exempt, but the district today includes $1.2 billion in taxable value and 30.6 in property tax revenue. Assessed values range significantly on the parcels. So the highest are really around the hospital, which is tax exempt, and then the core of the Burlington Mall. And we know you're sort of keeping an eye on these office and retail leases as companies sort of reevaluate their space needs with COVID. And so as we think about development, you think about, things that have lower assessed value might be right for redevelopment, but there's also a series of opportunity sites in this area. And so on the upper right, you can see that there's 2 parcels which have, either there's a project under construction, there's another project that's, proposed, but then there's also a series of pads that we would expect infill projects might, are highly likely to be pursued in the future. So the red ones are infill pads that would be on the tax rolls. There's obviously also some pads around Leahy that, depending on who developed, the pad, they might be tax exempt. They could be taxable if it was done like housing by a private developer or something like that. I'm going to let John explain the demand model and those assumptions.
Hey, good evening, everyone. I'm John Tremontosi. Just want to share with you, back when we did the original planning work around the mall in 2021, 2022, one of the things we did was sort of look at how much new growth the market might be able to support in terms of mixed use moving forward. Lost the numbers on that screen. But so what we did is we basically took a regional approach where we said we looked at employment forecasts for the Boston region to get a sense for where that might go over the next 5 to 10 years, and then essentially applied a capture methodology for the Burlington thinking about it as a submarket. What share of the growth was Burlington able to achieve in the preceding years, and what share of the growth might they achieve moving forward? And so in putting all of that together, essentially we came up with a with a number of about 1.6 million square feet of new demand over a 10-year period. And we broke it down into the different uses. The thing I'll note is that, this was all happening during the context of COVID, where office use and office use patterns had started to shift substantially at that time. It was a little bit at the beginning. Obviously, we can see how that's played out over time, but certainly the demand for office has been substantially impacted. So the office number is a little bit lower than maybe what we would have seen if we had done this pre-COVID. And then showing here about 1 million square feet of demand for new residential in the area. So all in all, a substantial number. I think we basically applied a 75% percentage of that to the mixed district specifically, because not all the parcels were included in the mixed district. So what you'll see moving forward is that the growth numbers we're using is 1.2 million square feet divided across the 4 different land uses, and then we basically applied revenue to those, which Amy will walk you through here in a second.
How was I advancing before? Let's see. Oh, here we go. Can I move this off? Is there a way to move that? Sorry. Something blocking the screen I'm looking at. Thank you. Okay. So we took the development assumptions, or the demand assumptions that John talked through, and we applied them to the 2 zoning scenarios. So on the very left column, you'll see the square footage that's there today in 2024 for both residential, commercial, and commercial exempt, so totaling 5.1 million square feet. Under the existing zoning, the only square footage that can be accommodated is the commercial square footage, and that's because residential is not allowed in the existing zoning unless you carve out a 10-acre planned development area. In the future proposed mixed-use zoning, we can pull in the full 10-year demand, both residential and commercial. And then we've differentiated the commercial because with additional households, you should be able to support additional retail. So the commercial number in the mixed-use zoning is higher, right? We've deducted a little bit from the existing zoning scenario. Anything else I want to say on this one?
Yeah, I just think if you think about it as a growth factor for the existing zoning, we're showing about 10% growth in the square footage, and with the mixed use, about close to 25% growth. So just as a way to think about it, order of magnitude.
Sorry, I got sticky,
click on
please.
this screen first. And then drag. Yeah.
All right. So the square footage assumptions, we then have translated into population numbers, and so I'm calling these corollary assumptions. We know that with existing zoning, we could be growing the daytime population, right? There's more people that would be coming to work in commercial buildings. With the mixed-use zoning, you would be growing, daytime population plus new households, which translates into residents and school children. And so these are the assumptions that feed the tables in the appendix, and the per capita calculations are from. Town-owned streets I've included in here because we had some conversations, with Melissa and the planning department. Is there additional public right-of-ways that would be included in the district as part of this, redevelopment? And the answer right now is no, right? We think there'd be privately owned but publicly accessible right-of-ways that may be added if you need to subdivide parcels. But at this point, the town is not planning on acquiring property for public right-of-ways, so that shows no change. I'm going to move this forward into, so the fiscal impact summary basically compares the line items going across. So there's the revenue basket up top and then the expense basket down below. And so 2024, we knew what the revenues were. We were able to calculate the property tax revenues, per parcel. For personal property tax, meals and hotels, we had to make some assumptions based on townwide data that we were provided with. But then as you grow that forward using the square footage in the existing zoning, you see the totals increasing. And so in the lower category in the expenses, I'll just go through those in a little bit more detail. So education, you see that there's really no change between today and existing zoning because there's no new residential. We're in mixed-use zoning with the addition of about 62 school children, using data that the school department supplied us with about the number of school children per unit for multifamily development. We have, a potential impact of $1.4 million.
Pause there for a second.
Yep.
And one thing to know about that, so we're assuming for the multifamily that, these are modern buildings with, fairly small units, primarily 1 and 2 bedroom units, which are producing, very low numbers of school children. So that's where that number comes from.
The public safety numbers are tied to per capita calculations for daytime population. The conversations with, the police basically were telling us, the population swells during the day, and we really need to think about not just, per resident, but the daytime population as well. So that's how that number increases. Public works, you'll see as it goes across, is relatively consistent. We included sort of a upscale factor of 5%, just expecting that some of the right-of-ways that they maintain might eventually get bike paths or be more complicated. So perhaps you'd need specialized equipment to plow, or there'd be additional demands on public works, but there's not new linear feet of right-of-way plans. And then Board of Health and Recreation use per capita calculations for residents. And so the net positive numbers that you get after the revenues and then the expenses are deducted, today it's $46.5 million. Under existing zoning with the square footages we showed you, 50.8, and then under the mixed use zoning, 53 million. So the mixed use zoning is likely to have a more beneficial net positive. Anything you want to add?
No, and just I guess the other thing to think about is the Third Avenue case study that we showed at the beginning. The mixed use value grows at a faster rate moving forward from here. So this shows a larger benefit to the mixed use right out of the gate, but we also expect that number would grow faster as well.
And then just a couple observations. So we know revenue growth exceeds expenses, and if you consider, as John says, the time horizon beyond 10 years, that net positive result increases. We think the area would maintain relevance and value, not just in Massachusetts, but all over the country. Mixed-use districts are performing better than singular-use office districts. We know market demand becomes accommodated, so you can now have sort of a live-work environment, which has, positives in terms of, traffic. You can assign trips for new commercial development to walking because the residential is next door. And then new residential audiences could bring support for additional retail, restaurant, and service establishments. We understand, there is an impact on schools, but there's been some declines in early education or elementary schools and high school grade levels. So conversations with the school department indicate there's capacity. They encourage, maintaining your school sites just to safeguard the district for growth in the future. The public safety, team talked about how shifts in land uses really shift the nature of their calls. So with, for example, retail, you might have calls related to shoplifting, where a residential would give you calls related to domestic disputes, something like that. So they continually adapt, but it's not something that they were concerned about in terms of, demands on the department beyond what they feel they can absorb. We understand infrastructure capacity exists, so the town has utility supply with connectivity to MWRA for water, and Eversource is constructing a second substation for the electrification needs. And then there's some additional work that the planning department will be doing, looking at sort of complete street design. So that term refers to designing streets for all roadway users, not just cars. So additional bike lanes, pedestrian accommodations, things like that. So the mixed-use zoning encourages complete streets and sort of organizes the zoning around that idea. And so, that could be something that the planning department does some additional work to understand the costs of those. So that is everything. I welcome questions.
John, I know John has some questions. He sent me a couple, and he said he had more. John, you're up.
I keep it up in case I have to flip to a table in the back. Thank you.
Yeah, so as the chair says, I do have a few questions. So first off, I'll preface that I think anything that gets us to breaking even as opposed to things declining due to office vacancies killing our commercial market and so on is a good place to be. And part of this is just making sure that the numbers actually support what you're saying. I think leaving the accommodated accounts out is a mistake. If you go through it, it's pretty much 50-50 for education versus general government. When you go through the numbers, it's what I came up with. John may come up with a slightly different number, but I think that's the right ballpark. So I think the point is that means the education cost is really about 50% higher per student than you're showing here, I think.
I think the accommodated accounts are in the school per pupil numbers based on the state's Chapter 70 reporting document.
Well, does it include everything from the accommodated accounts, transportation, special ed?
Yes.
Bonding?
It includes transportation. We looked at that.
Right, I know
because
you put transportation
there was a
in there,
concern about
but-
adding a bus.
But special ed is a huge adder also.
I can look back at that.
It's just looking at your $79 million number, I wasn't able to reproduce that. It's a little higher than the operating budget, but it's way less than the operating budget plus the accommodated account.
So the 79 million includes a Chapter 70 state aid payment.
Well, no, I saw that you take 10 off to get to 69 for that.
It's not high enough, yeah.
But the starting number of 79 doesn't, it would be interesting in understanding how you got to that because it doesn't add up for me.
Okay.
And again, it's not that the conclusion is a bad one to get to. I think if there are what appear to be understated expenses, it eats into your argument is credibility would be my concern. I think there's, outside of the cost analysis, this is adding 1,100 residents to, our roughly 26,000. So it's like a 4% increase. So, independent financial analysis, I think, the town collectively needs to think about whether having that kind of population increase is what we're trying to do or not. But that,
It is over 10 years, right?
it is over time, but yep. But going back to the cost-related things, you touched on this a little bit. I'm curious to understand the expected demographics of who's living there. It's just, the 0.08 students per family unit, appears low. I see where you got it from. But, which of those is actually representative of what we're likely to get here?
So we made an intentional decision to use your own data, so she's putting this up. That seemed like the fairest comparison, since you do have some relatively new multifamily buildings very close by, versus choosing something from maybe a different town that it's much easier for people to say that's not us. So,
Right.
but just for context, because we do this work in other towns, and we're doing it currently in other towns, so we're looking at a lot of these buildings, that is on the low side. But in general, all the numbers we're seeing with this kind of, 4-story multifamily, primarily rental product, or that all the numbers are low, but you could see getting a slightly higher number if for whatever reason whatever it gets built attracts a slightly different demographic. Like we've worked with, you see some buildings that are in the 0.15, even as high as 0.2 kind of range. So we're not set in stone on that number, but we thought it was better to use your actual data.
It's not a bad starting point, certainly. It's just, it's a potential risk on the expense.
Yeah, the flip side I'll say though is more commonly we see people try to be too conservative with it, and it overstates, and then almost always the number of kids that are actually produced are way, way less than, because we do fiscal impact reports for specific projects, and we always get pushed into a higher number, and then when the project gets built, it's like, well, no, it was half of that, so what it's worth.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
So I'm curious how, what the expectation of what goes in here. So in particular, the question is, are we expecting that the commercial increases a little and we add residential, that residential is starting to replace some of the commercial, or what happens with what we have now versus where you see it 10 years from now?
It's a good question. I mean, so we don't specifically make any assumptions about that in this analysis, because there's ample, what I'll say, development sites, right, in terms of like parking lots that could be redevelopment. So redeveloped. So we're not saying like with the 1,000 residential units, we didn't make an assumption about like 20% of that is redevelopment of an existing building, for example. So we're sort of agnostic to that.
Well, I'm curious if that's really true, because in looking at what you've got here, it feels like the assumption is we sort of maintain the current commercial and the infill is all additional stuff. There's no X's anywhere of things that are.
That's what I'm saying. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. That is how we thought about it. We're not saying that any of this is renovated residential space, for example.
So in particular, I think the thing that we would worry about from a revenue point of view would be the mall gets torn down and a huge apartment complex goes in there. I think from a tax point of view, that would be undesirable, and probably undesirable for other reasons too. But do we? Yeah,
that's not just in the real world. That's not really what we see happening typically. It's usually the existing commercial spaces often will get reused. Sometimes it's a use that people don't like as much or doesn't produce as much tax revenue, but it's not a residential use. The residential stuff is usually done on, like I said, on the parking pads. Is typically how we see it in a mall type location.
And so a lot of the infill in the mall area is on the parking lot. Is the assumption that there's structured parking making up for the loss of all the parking?
Yeah, I could speak to this a little bit more in terms of the zoning proposal that is actually coming to town meeting. So the way it's structured now, it explicitly states that we're incentivizing infill development, and we currently have a requirement per development site that there remains a 60-40 split commercial to residential on every development site per square footage. There is some allowance there if you can't meet that, but the intention is explicitly stated that this commercial district's intended to be predominantly commercial, and there's also provision currently that does not, at this time, allow any office to residential conversions. And that's explicit because of that sentiment from the outset. The idea to allow residential has been strategically allowing residents to enhance the value and support the commercial, whether it's office or retail, over time. And that has kind of been the thrust of this, the zoning proposal. So whereas John and Amy is looking at demand and looking at assuming a 10-year time point with everything developed, the zoning is trying to shape what comes in under each development site to keep the balance as much as possible.
So it is the 60/40, is that enforced per lot, per new development?
Per what we call a development site.
So what is a development site?
Well, if the project that's proposed is, assembling 2 parcels, that is the development site. If the project that's proposed is on 1 parcel, that's a development site. And then what we're looking at is the way that the 60/40 can be counted, and that is through existing square footage, or you could count new square footage through mixed use, or you can work with planning board to just say, hey, the real estate cycle just doesn't work for the commercial office right now, but here's our plan. Here we're planning to do, the residential portion now, and we're keeping this development pad for commercial in the future, but they have to show that through a site plan.
Okay, so one possibility is, for instance, if it was the mall, that they could count the mall as commercial, and then the 40% could be the infill development on that site. Okay, so, all right, so that would presumably prevent someone from tearing down an office building and making an apartment complex.
Correct.
Because that was going from 100 to 0. Okay, that makes sense. And then just an understanding question. When you say vertical versus horizontal mixed use, do you mean physically?
Yes.
Okay, so vertical meaning there's residences on top of a commercial enterprise. Okay, great. I better stop there. Thank you.
Other questions? Mike?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Slide 16, demand forecast. I wasn't quite following that as quickly as you were explaining it. Can you flip to that? Let me see if I can explain it so you can tell me if I understand it correctly. So in the little table, you're showing 2 kind of studies that happened, one in 2022, and then the mixed one is 2024.
Yeah, so the 2022, it's the same set of numbers. So 2022 is when the analysis happened. So that's sort of our 10-year demand forecast of mixed use in the district. The second column, all it's doing is applying that number to the actual parcels in play here. So it's just basically reducing it by 25% because the area that was looked at is slightly larger than the mixed district as it's defined.
Okay.
Does that make sense? So we're just reducing that number by 25%.
And so it seems like the demand forecast is sort of a core piece to the whole pie that you're showing us. I guess I'd like to have some comfort in the methodology that was used so we know that these numbers are going to bear out.
Sure. So the main thing that we're trying to do, so like if you think about the new zoning, right, the capacity of what could be built under the new zoning is a very large number, right? If you said if you were to redevelop every empty parking lot, to the level that the zoning allows, you would have many, many millions of square feet, and we know that the market's not going to absorb that over 5 or 10 years, right? And the town probably doesn't want that to happen that fast, right? So this way is sort of the market supportable demand. So what we look at is regional employment growth, right? So looking at all the different kind of forecasts of what will happen in the Boston metro. So saying, okay, it's going to grow by this many jobs every year. And then basically saying, okay, how much square footage does that translate into specifically on the commercial side, right? So basically translating jobs into commercial square footage. And then for the Burlington piece, we look back over time about, okay, as Boston has grown and changed historically, what share of that growth has Burlington captured? And by the way, we can add more of this on here as backup if it's helpful, but what has Burlington captured historically, their sort of share of that metro growth? And so those are the numbers we're using to say, okay, based on this new forecast from 2022 to 2032, if Burlington captured that same sort of share of employment growth, how much space does that translate into? That's the essential. There's more nuances to it, but that's the essential methodology of how we're doing that. And then the residential, so as you know, the region's very undersupplied with housing, right? So theoretically, there's probably even more to for the residential. So that we're sort of connecting the residential to the commercial with sort of a jobs to housing balance type of thing, because you have to cap it somehow. You could probably build an endless amount of residential in the Boston metro.
what's the 63%, 68%? What does that mean?
That's just the percent of the overall total of the,
That's how it's split.
Yeah, it doesn't have 200.
yeah, I'll have to look what I did with
I'm not
that.
actually sure, but I don't think it adds, it clearly doesn't.
It doesn't add.
Oh, okay, so it's
Over 100.
Or it was adding across, but we'll look at that. I don't know.
Other questions?
So, just to add to that one too, because I think as you're looking at, I think there's two ways to look at it, in terms of providing new zoning that allows for new development capacity. This zoning is providing a little more flexibility, allows for different building types too. So it does talk about, allowing residential, commercial, lab. And I think that, if one was to build like every parcel available lab, that's a different, square footage, it's a different amount. And whereas what John's team tried to do, just kind of more like a private sector developer would do before they move in and propose a project in a town. They want to understand what is the absorption rate, how much demand is there for that type of office if I build it, or that type of residential. So he looks at the same numbers and growth patterns as developers do to try to get a sense of what the capacity is if something is built there. The zoning, if you're just looking at strictly numbers too, you can build, even if we increase the height, 10 stories, you can build a lot and you can say you can build 10 million square feet. But what we're saying is that demand might not be there. And then there's also the constraint of how we've structured the zoning to, John's point, we've had some guardrails in terms of the guidance to develop the development community. Like we want to see more commercial, as well as the residential. We want to see more open space, so we've included the 20% open space. Those things I can also go into detail more, and that's kind of what I've been doing with the land use committees. But from this analysis is coming more from the private sector kind of analysis of how one would look at proposing projects in the area, if that's right.
And just for example, on the retail side, you see it's a relatively small number, and part of that is based on the fact that this area is, very highly retailed, restaurant retail currently. So the thought is, not to overdo it, right? You want to try to keep spaces kind of occupied. So that number's is low for that reason. You're already highly retailed.
Does this assume that any current vacant office space is going to be filled? Or how do you?
It does. So at the time, the vacancy rate was not as high as it is now, though. So when this analysis was done, it was sort of like you were starting to have some of the impact from COVID, but I think it was still lower than it is now. So there's probably some additional couple percentage points of additional vacant space today than there was when we did this.
But so we're proposing building out, potentially building out, a certain number of square feet for all this stuff. And at the same time, we currently, I don't know how much we have existing and occupied, so that's built into the formula
It
here.
is, yeah, and so we assume, so like for each kind of use, there's sort of like a stabilized kind of occupancy rate. Like so for residential, it's like 92%. For office, it might be 85%. For retail, it might be 90%. Where you say like that's sort of a healthy level. You're always going to have some level of vacancy, right? So you might be a couple percentage points below that now. But you weren't when we did this analysis. That makes sense.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll try not to ask the same questions. So first of all, the 1.2 million square feet new growth estimate, that is all based on build-out beyond buildings that exist today in this area. So that's all new stuff, one way or another. So the 1.2 million number that you've got, I think, is driven off of the 22 estimates downsized for the square footage that the land we want to make available.
Right.
what makes us so sure that there is that kind of demand over the next 10 years?
It's just based on doing the analysis. This is what we do for a living, so it's very much a combination of, well, I'll say qualitative and judgmental methodology. So there's no true science. The number's certainly not correct, but is it a reasonable forecast? I think so. It's primarily driven by residential, right? If you look at it, and there's certainly plenty of demand for residential.
Okay.
So I can tell you the number's probably wrong, but is it a reasonable estimate? I think so.
Well, so my first worry would be not so much over 10 years can you get to that number, but the rate at which it would go. And it's pretty clear. We see this, we have evidence of this in the downtown overlay district. We have evidence all around Boston, and you said it again tonight. When the developer comes in with the constraints of a mixed-use parcel, say out of the 1.2 million, they get, a couple 100,000 square feet. They're constrained to the 60/40 requirement. And almost assuredly over the next 5 years, they're going to build out the residential far faster than the commercial, almost guaranteed.
Yes.
And in my mind, there's a real likelihood, just depending on the demand for new kinds of commercial space, which is some combo of new kinds of office space, lab space, high-tech space, that it's just going to go a lot slower. And so that's going to just sit there empty until it finally makes sense to them, right? We have no way to make it happen any faster. None, right?
No, I mean, I think I would agree with you that where we sit right now, the residential is more attractive and would happen a lot faster than the commercial. But again, these things are always going through cycles, right? I mean,
Well, that's the question. What's the cycle? We just don't know. I don't think we can even figure it out. The economy's going to drive a lot of it. The Boston economy is going to drive a lot of it. Okay, so with that in mind, the residential revenues are all based on the residential tax rate. There's no commercial, the 2-to-1 commercial uptick isn't going to kick in until you build a commercial building and tax it. So for that period of time where our 40% residential dominates, the revenues are going to be at the residential rate. So did you project the rate of build-out of all of it, which would determine the rate of the revenue coming in?
No, we did not. And what I'll say is, when we're looking at these projects, some of the projects we look at are just residential or primarily residential, right? And at lower tax rates, typically.
It'll be a lot lower.
Yeah, having to accommodate for school children, typically. They're still net fiscally positive, generally speaking, but not as much so as commercial, as you know. So, but no, we did not look at it as like a, as a phase year by year kind of build out. We're not looking
Or
at
even a,
sites.
yeah, all right.
Yeah.
All right, so that's a bit of a worry now.
Yeah.
If we don't do the rezoning, it's sort of like roads. If you don't build the roads, the cars won't come. If you don't do the mixed-use rezoning, the mixed-use opportunity won't present. So assuming we did this rezoning pretty much the way you've laid it out, where do you get your confidence level that we're going to win, we're going to attract whatever the rate of the greater Boston area is, that Burlington's going to attract its full quota of those developers? Why wouldn't Bill Ricker or Lexington or Waltham or whatever do better?
So again, the numbers are primarily driven by residential, right? In terms of the lion's share of this is residential, and I think
That's not my worry.
but I would say any community in the greater Boston area that allows for that to be built is going to win, because it's just way undersupplied. I mean, if you look at Lexington right now,
The residential.
right? And then on commercial, I mean, in terms of a high-performing suburban commercial district, Burlington's one of the best ones in the whole region. In terms of the amount of high-quality space, the occupancy levels, the tax dollars that are kicked off. It's one of the better sort of suburban commercial cores. So there's no reason to believe that will change, and particularly if you add a mix of uses, I think it gets more valuable and it gets more valuable.
All right, so I kind of believe you. I mean, I think we've got a good track record.
Frank,
You almost convinced him.
Frank, I wanted to add that, I'll just take us back a little bit to our most local, the case study on the PDD, which tries to show you kind of, there's that map, which is in 2005. And if you didn't do anything, so if we go to the next slide, maybe the next one with the graph.
I don't have the full case study in here.
Well, I mean, you have the graph, essentially. Essentially, like, if we did not change the PDD, or the Northwest Park,
Right.
and allow for the PDD, and most of that kind of stayed unchanged and was kind of operating, it would still do okay. And we have it, in today's dollars at $3.2 million tax revenue coming in. The idea is that the PDD town meeting did allow for the change, did allow for, this opportunity to expand development capacity, allow for residential, and increase the different tenant opportunities that we're seeing in the Northwest Park, allowing in particular R&D, not just commercial office, and the residential, which I think, you can very much tie, if you look deep enough, to what is today the $6.3 million of tax revenue coming in from that same space. So if you didn't change that zoning, you would be looking at much less in terms of the tax revenue coming in from that same space.
So,
And then to think about that with, regards to kind of your point on, how do we know this is coming about? We know in the PDD that 90% of that commercial space is occupied. They
In
only have
Northwest
10
Park.
Yeah, they only have 10% vacancy compared to the 18% that you see in generally
So,
speaking in the region.
Northwest Park is probably a grand slam success. And even though it's a PDD, it could just as easily have been, it's pretty much a mixed-use
Right.
zone.
Right, that's,
And it's got, tremendous draw because of the quality and the mix of what's in there. But you've got to replicate that again over another, how many square feet is Northwest Park? Do you know off the top of your head?
I don't have that right off the top of my head.
But the scale of it's probably a third of what we're talking about here? More?
I'll go back
That would
and
be
check.
curious.
It's almost,
So we have to kind of replicate that, but not with the PDD, but with force zoning. I mean, Nordblum did what they did. They crafted with the town the PDD, and they left themselves a lot of room for live, work, and play. And so Lifetime's finally paid off, Wegmans paid off, they've got a lot of commercial in there. It really is a huge success. But we've got to replicate that. And what I'm worried about is their occupancy is high, but if you were to just make another one of those, I'm not so sure you could build it out. I mean, it took them 10 years to build that out, first of all.
well, it's almost 20
Years.
years, right? I mean, it was
Oh, right.
2008 when the PDD
Right.
was adopted.
Yeah, so it was a long runway, right?
So it takes a long time, but I mean, I think how we're seeing this, those PDDs are uniquely different because they are one master developer.
Yes.
And they've come to Burlington, the town meeting, and said, this is what we want to do. This has been very different, and the proposal that town meeting will see in January is saying, hey, we understand what the development community wants to do. There's multiple owners, and we understand what the community wants out of this. If we give the developers more development capacity, we want to see more of what we want, which has been what we've heard more about walkability and open space, and that's why we have built in the 20% open space for every project. We've kept the balance it's required. The harder part that I've seen with the land use committees has been their concern about height. Any building, whether it's a residential or commercial, I feel like that's been their concern, I would say. And, I think Land Use Committee had brought up some good points on the uses, but what we've blended with is the idea of the BG uses and innovation district uses that much more kind of replicate the PDD, the Northwest Park PDD.
Yeah, I think that this concept of rezoning that much space as mixed use with the requirements that we're looking at is clearly, in my opinion, is headed in the right direction. The first thing will be how it, over time, what's the complexion of what gets built out. And I think it's pretty clear that housing is going to dominate for quite some time. Could be as much as 10 years. It's certainly going to be 5, in my opinion.
Yeah. I don't
Yeah.
know, 10's-
All right, so we have to kind of put that in the back of our head. And so, given that there's multiple developers, when you take one of these parcels, the question is, can the developer's commitment to the commercial side wane or never materialize because they couldn't land what they wanted to land, right? Nordblum worked really hard to land the right things. They didn't get them all. They got a lot of good ones. So the developers got to compete, land, and make an economical pitch to their investors to land the commercial properties in that less than 10-year period. And I just don't know how quickly that'll happen. So I think we have to be prepared for that to be slow. And so the revenues will be reflected predominantly, and the costs, off of the residential, which unfortunately has, I think, a slightly higher expense profile and a much lower revenue profile.
Yep.
So you'll have to work pretty hard to break
But I would also
evens.
say, I mean, Northwest, during that time period, I mean, there's other commercial activity happening as well, right? And there's the districts, there's some of the new kind of infill stuff around the mall. So there's been,
Others, yeah.
there's been others as well.
Yeah, okay. All right, so enough on that. I guess the 60/40 mix on commercial versus residential, you picked because you thought that's what the developers would need. Now, there's a certain mix that they have to have of residents in order for the whole mixed-use thing to be vibrant, right? It's enough money to be spent on the retail stuff, enough people living there to work at the offices, to the commute works for them and all of that. So how did you pick the 60/40?
Part of it was through some of the analysis that CBRE had done about the vibrant mixed-use communities. Part of it had been looking and working with kind of the administration and reviewing the history of assessed values in the area and looking at, this is a commercially dominant area, trying to look at the overall community's balance of 2/3 to 1/3 commercial revenue coming in, and the square footage. And then there's some case studies in other communities, I think, across the board, from Maynard to Somerville, who have looked in putting in these kind of standards to kind of keep up the commercial component. And they've ranged from 75% and 25%, 75 commercial and 25% residential. And it was too heavy on the commercial. They saw nothing developed. So that was, kind of taken into consideration, and so landed on the 60/40 with some flexibility still, because even in the zoning it does say that if there's something that's more possible, something that we're missing, that does have kind of an alternative compliance component to it that the planning board could consider. So there is that.
Do you know what the ratio of Northwest Park is, commercial versus residential?
Square footage wise, I don't, so I
Yeah.
could double check that.
Because,
It's a lot more commercial.
yeah, I would guess.
I got those two residential
Lifetime
towers.
and, right, and they
It runs
got,
that whole 3-mile stretch up.
yeah.
Yeah.
So that would be an interesting comp for us. I mean, I think it's to our advantage if the buyers will come to have the ratio tilted much more to the commercial as much as possible and still land all of the mixed-use business, the ones we want, right? I mean, that works in our favor. So I just don't know about that.
Yeah, I don't know. And this is kind of my own, 2 cents, having observed and followed some of the data over the last several years, that, I feel pretty bullish about Burlington. I'm really confident in, happens here in this commercial corridor. We know even after COVID, the mall has come back pretty strong, one of the strongest in the New England coast. And then we have about 8 million visits annually that go to that mall alone. We've still seen some of the leases, yes, there's been pruning back, but there's still a strong interest from some of the new R&D and what they're calling hard tech, green tech businesses that are expanding and coming out. I think with the Broad, even though there's some pruning back in the life science, we all know that, having the Broad presence here as an anchor is dynamite. It's huge, and I don't think that, as human health and wellness is not going to be something that people start to get disinterested in. I think humans will always kind of naturally be interested in how to live healthier lives, and that's what a lot of that science is based on. So I think we have a lot of advantages here, and I think the development pressures will, we will always have them. It's just how we want to shape them. And that's what the zoning has done, and then that's what through this effort has been like the analysis to say, hey, even with shaping it, because not everyone's happy with the zoning. Developers want more.
Yeah.
A lot of communities, some of the planning board members have said they want less, and we're trying to still thread the needle to something that's feasible.
I feel like you've scaled it back. I feel like the shaping of it's good. I think where we're headed is really good. We've got to do a mixed use, opportunity. The real question is how quickly we can get the commercial to actually come into it. That's the real question. And what can we do to make that happen more smoothly and sooner rather than later? So that's where all of my thinking is, my worries are at.
You guys are in a good position. We work with mall properties around the country, and many of them are dying, and they don't have really the luxury of making a choice. They're sort of forced to do something like this. So I think it's good to.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Roger?
Hopefully I'll try to be tactical and not revisit too much of that. Burlington has a fairly unique geographical location that I think is going to serve us well for a long time. It's hard to take that away from us. With respect to residential and commercial, I think having the residential come in earlier than the other development of the commercial stuff is a pretty likely route of things. I would expect the developers, when they put up a residential building, very likely the first floor is going to have some commercial component in it, whether it's, a gym or dry cleaner or something. So I don't think it's either every building is all residential or all commercial. We already have a lot of commercial in Boston, in the district. That's not going to go away. And since the occupancy rate is fairly high at the moment, I don't think it's going to get worse. Having the people come in will draw will develop the more retail-oriented and services that cater to those the local clientele. Obviously, we've got plenty of fast food places in the mall and a lot of things, but there's a subset of retail and businesses that will cater to those new residents, and that will develop. It will be a slow start in terms of tax revenues because the new commercial uses will be slow to start up. But I think the other point is that not going to some different zoning locks us in where we are today in terms of development potential. Even if we rezone it to the mixed use, and developers don't find that they can actually, capitalize on that, we're no worse off, potentially, I don't think. So I guess I would fret a little bit about the slow development, the slow rise of the revenue. I think it'll be delayed because of this shift. But if we're tolerant of any kind of development, I think this is the kind of thing we have to do. One of the concerns I have has to do with traffic. The numbers that I was looking at, I guess it's on page 18, seemed like there was only, extra 500, 600 daytime residents. And I guess I didn't quite know where that came from. It's like 2/3 of the way down. maybe I was misreading, there was a line that was daytime population, total town 45,000. I thought the daytime population of Burlington was more like 100 and something thousand.
So the residential numbers are above that. So it's 1,235 is the new residential
All right.
population. The daytime is more driven by the commercial square footage, like people who are working in the buildings during the day.
So this, all right. I guess just in terms of concerns that people have about it, they're going to be concerned about traffic, always. So however that can be addressed, these numbers seem kind of low in terms of my sense of it.
Thank-
So the number of new households basically looks at the residential square footage and assumes that, a square footage per unit, about 1,000 square feet.
Can you speak into the microphone, just for the
Oh, sorry.
TV?
To translate from residential square footage to residential units, we're just using a metric of 1,000 square feet per unit, and then we're looking at the average household size, for multifamily households, and that's how that household number is being generated.
1.5. Okay,
1.5 people per household.
all right, thanks.
Anybody else before John?
Traffic
Yeah.
was not part of our scope, but I understand the concern.
That's true. I'll say just to the traffic piece, it's not lost on us that, traffic is part of that. We had submitted to the state, a grant for MassWorks to look at the Middlesex Turnpike and safety and crossing. They awarded us $1 million on this most recent grant cycle. We're also working with MAPC, and MAPC is doing a mobility action plan for this area. We just, as a community, we have not had a lot of studies done in this area to enhance, multimodal safety and ways to move around this area other than the car. And so now we're, with those two opportunities, we're looking at how to enhance it. But the other thing is, I know we mentioned with the smart growth and the idea of having those same kind of users for the same, retail and potentially office. We have some numbers, again, looking at the Northwest Park PDD, the Tremont, Huntington, and Lifetime, they have estimated numbers around at least 50% of those residents work in Burlington who reside in those apartment buildings. Does that mean they're all walking there? Not necessarily, but they're more local, so.
David?
So again, without getting into a lot of the same questions, just a few. I know you've had extensive talks with people. The rezoning is needed. We just have to figure it out. Business community. So that the whole thing about how quick might this get done. The case study on Northland's property was, again, a planned family that wanted to get to this, to get to some point. The town met to kind of develop that growth, and we knew there was a time frame for it to be done. And they pieced it together as to how we all work together to do that. By rezoning this with multiple people, some that may be interested in redevelopment, other ones that may not be interested in redevelopment, almost like the overlay district. You have residential, but the commercial people really don't want to do anything with their properties for now because it's like taking money, you may not get that eventually. So I think the increased zoning helps. The question is on about what is the business community thinking right now? You've had some conversations with them. The mall has seen a lot of redevelopment over there right now already. They're not going to get rid of that. So how does that develop into the ultimate scheme, which is if we had the normal informant, we could say, this is what we want to do with the whole strip. And and let's plan to get that. This isn't going to be that. So what is your conversation? What's your idea? What's your input? What, again, residential is going to come quick, but where does that fit, and does it plan like what?
Yes, thanks for the question. I know there is a lot there, and I don't want to overwhelm everyone, but we have been in communication with most of the property owner reps for all the rezoning. And in this area, particularly, it'd be Macy's, Lord and Taylor, Simon, Brixmore, R.J. Kelly, and Kohl's, which is RK Centers. And we've been in communication with the chamber. So I would say overall, they have supported the initiative to, look at how to enhance the commercial district. And they all see that, introducing people and allowing them to live there is a very important part of that. Unlike being a developer and coming to town meeting to propose a project, we are just laying out the blueprint, and so that makes it a little bit more challenging, admittedly. But what we think, through the planning department, through my office, and the people who've been involved, the idea is that laying the zoning out the way we have with what they call a regulating plan gives much more structure, or developers call it prescriptive, guidance to the development. And when they say prescriptive, sometimes they admittedly don't like it because it forces their hand where some things might have to go, or some of the quantity of the open space. But what it does do, it brings them more to the table. So what we've had conversations with is like, this is our vision for how it's going to work together and what we'd like to see. And so that now Macy's, Simon, they've, started at least talking to one another, which you would think that would happen, but not necessarily. Usually developers work on their parcel, and that's how you have, I don't have the best images on here right now, but you have buildings facing, the opposite direction. Here we have an indication that we want the public realm is important to us, and so it has to connect to the parcel adjacent. So it explains that in the zoning, and then planning board has been given what we call the design guidelines and handbook with supplemental for the design of the buildings that, again, help them explain and use a vocabulary to get the developers to work together. It doesn't ensure it as like one master developer, here's a master plan, is nice and neat in a package, I'd say, but it gets us closer than, I think, the helter-skelter development that we would see otherwise. Otherwise, we see kind of the Kohl site and is it Citizens Bank, the drive-through. That's infill development, but that's not, I think, the value add of infill development that we'd like to see there. Even Crate and Barrel. The mall put Crate and Barrel on their site. There's no pedestrian connectivity. There's no public realm. There was no additional real green space on that development. Now with the new zoning, it would require that. It would require kind of connections, public realm, the investment in the public realm, as well as the open space. A drive-through would not be allowed. Those kind of things are now much more explicit in the zoning for the developers, and so they know what to expect when they're coming here. It's a higher level of design that we're expecting, and I think we're worth it, so I think that's why we're demanding it.
Quick.
Yeah, just one question. So a few years back, when the mall wanted to really expand into the food area and was asking for a whole bunch of extra liquor licenses, the issue came up that at the exact same town meeting, we needed to allocate funds for a legal fight because they were trying to get an abatement. So I think we're right in the same situation here, where I believe we have a number of properties that are fighting us on abatements. How do we get those cleared up so that we can do something for them? I think town meeting is going to be reluctant to say, yeah, let's make it easy for you to, redevelop and add a bunch of new stuff, but at the same time, you're fighting our current tax bill. So why should we believe you're going to pay the new one?
I guess I can speak to that a little bit, John. Well, I did talk to the assessor, and, part of it is that there's just kind of the system is a little broken. This is across the board in every, municipality, and that, tax, tax abatement lawyers, do get paid no matter, what kind of, it's a percentage of whatever they settle on. So, looking at this now, historically, there's always been abatements filed on commercial properties. I did look for this area. The Kohl's and the Macy's did have abatements filed for different years. And I think nothing would change that even without the zoning. So, I think...
Well, I think my point is,
Yeah.
we're in a negotiating position here. I don't think we want to just give them everything without getting that resolved, would be my suggestion. And I believe town meeting will tend to have that same feeling. Why are we trying to give you something when you're not paying your tax bill?
Right.
I realize it's a lot more complicated, but that's how the simplified version will play.
Actually, John, we want something from them. We want them to develop it.
You could look at it that way.
We're not giving it.
Okay. Well,
That's not a good way to bargain.
I did just want to add.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to I had a question about the traffic concerns. A lot of the talk has been building up new residential and commercial. I think the assumption is that people who work in Burlington, daytime population, will also be living in Burlington. But there is a significant population who works in Burlington but commutes here. Has there been any consideration for increasing public transportation options for people who work outside or live outside of Burlington but commute here?
In terms of, that is a tricky question in terms of transportation in general because it's such a regional issue. We've been involved with the Transportation Management Association. There's the TMA. We have 2 TMAs in the area, which those kind of support commercial and private sector partnerships with the state that help move people around essentially through shuttle services. I don't know if you've seen those. There's like kind of, there's the Hartwell, it's right now, it's the Middlesex 3 TMA and the 128 Business Council is the other TMA. So those are the 2. And we've been in communication with the MBTA and the Better Bus Network, which is like the one that has been looking at where they're pruning back routes and where they're keeping routes. And we've been in communication with them. Part of what we're looking at with this zoning too has been, making sure we enhance the, the bus stops and things like that. But we haven't specifically called out any additional, added investment to, I guess, the bus network as it stands. As much as we can, we've been trying to advocate for the different modes, working with our regional partners, but I think that's been legitimately a struggle. So how I've seen this is that getting people into Burlington is going to remain a challenge, period. What I think about is this corridor is like, once you're here though, once you're parked, my vision is that, the development and how we build this becomes like, you don't have to drive your car, again, to go across the street to Middlesex Turnpike to maybe go to the AMC theaters anymore. You don't have to get in your car to, drive up and across the street to, let's say, I don't know, well, Blaze Pizza's not there anymore, but across the street to Brixmore site. So, those things, like those enhancements are important and those things need to be addressed, but I think that's where, the state, I think they've indicated with that $1 million, that $1 million is only a feasibility and kind of concept design money, so that they know once we have that we'll probably be coming back to the state for construction and improvements. So that's part of it. It's not lost. It's not just an easy question to answer, I guess.
Thank you.
Just quickly, I would just add, one of the feedbacks that I've heard from people in the chamber is if we pass these things and add more residential, they feel like it's going to help fill some of the empty office space that they're worried about now. Because what they're hearing from owners is we need more places for people to live closer to work. And especially some of the companies that are, look here to move out from Kenmore or from Boston or other places in Cambridge, they also need to be able to have housing. And then they want it to be around amenities and restaurants and shops. And so it may help us just deal with some of the empty office space that we're concerned about as well. So I'm not sure what you're looking for, Melissa. Are you looking for some kind of approval between now and town meeting in January, just to say that we're on board with this? I don't think we're ready to do that tonight, but.
I guess at this point, and for this meeting, I was just looking for, questions and, a thorough, deep, the input from this body so that we can bring it to the select board. The select board will hear this at their next meeting. So any input or, ideas, flags that you want to raise that to their attention will be important. And I think at the select board meeting, they'll probably look and not only looking at accepting this report, but then looking to take a position on the zoning itself, as this is part of the analysis for that. So any other input or comments on this is helpful. And I don't know if this board is going to take a position on the zoning itself.
We can take a position on anything, especially if it has any financial impact, but I don't know that we will. We can bring that up and talk about it.
Typically, we don't on zoning, but
We can talk about it if anybody has a strong feeling. I would suggest maybe make sure you get some good supportive feedback maybe from the Chamber of Commerce folks.
Mr. Chair,
Go ahead.
can I ask one follow-up question
Yes.
to your residential comment? You were talking about the occupancy rate at Third Ave, and you said it's about 90%. Is that for the commercial, residential, or both?
That was for the commercial.
What's the residential occupancy rate? Is it full out?
Last I heard, it was it was strong. I don't remember a percentage on that one. I can get that, though.
Because I think because the way I'm seeing this, and I'm new to this, but it looks like the majority of the growth is on the residential side of things. So, when you look at the proposed gross square footage for residential versus commercial, commercial's increasing like 10%, residential's increasing significantly. So I just wanted to make sure that we have that we can tie that back to what's actually happened in these existing mixed-use residential areas.
my impression about residences at Northwest Park is they're priced to be almost full.
Yeah, that's the key,
Yeah.
the pricing.
Just to partly answer your question about should this board even take a position, my personal view as a member of the committee is the financial health of Burlington really hinges on new growth, and new growth hinges on development. And the only way we're going to get the level of development that we're looking for over the next 10 years is with this kind of analysis and approach to the zoning, so that we create the roads for the cars to drive on, for the developers to build on. So I really think this is fundamentally crucial to what we need to get done, and it's headed in the right direction. It's been scaled back. So if you were looking for, a view financially of this from the board, my view would be it's fundamental. It's really important to do if you take a 10-year look at this, because if we don't keep the new growth coming, it's a disaster. And you can see it from the Broad Institute, what it's done for us. That's just like a grand slam, right? If you could do that, not exactly that, but say for every Broad Institute, you had one or two major projects come in on like a 3 to 5 year clip, that really goes a long way. So I think it's important that we do this, and I think it's going in the right direction.
Excellent. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for all your time and your great questions. Really appreciate it. And we'll take this back to the Select Board. I think it's on the 19th. I have to double check. Their next meeting.
The 18th.
18th, thank you. Thanks, Frank. Thank you so much. And always feel free to follow up with us. Thank you.
Thank you. So, moving on, next item is just a little discussion about kind of the capital budget planning process. Town Hall 1 had a combined meeting with some of the town officials and Mark Woods from Capital Budget Committee, and just trying to get some things moving.
So I could give a recap of that. So Town Hall 1 held a meeting specifically to look at capital planning, and we also covered debt service and debt exclusion, and Ed attended it, John attended it, and a number of people from the administration. So it was a good meeting. We really did get down to, from the point of view of planning capital projects, I think we have a pretty good recent history that says it's been awkward at best to get the different factions that want to do this and how they want to finance it and when they're going to do it mapped into a clearly understood and manageable debt plan. And so the goal of this meeting was to get our arms around how do we run that better. And John just left, but he was there. What we have concluded is that we really need an advisory committee for capital planning. We really need that, and it needs to be multidisciplined, and they should explicitly take on the role of building out on a year-on-year basis the next run of the 10-year plan. 10-year plans is what the state kind of says you really need to do, and they give you a pretty good guideline on what that is composed of and who's in charge of it. So we had that meeting. We're looking for John to put together a multidisciplinary team. There'd be someone from Ways and Means, Capital Budget, Rec, the administration, schools, and would literally plow through what everybody's got, latest and greatest for their 10-year needs, timing, justifications of merit, timing, best ideas on cost, and then we can roll that into this projection mechanism that all of you, Ed and John, have done a ton of work on this, and we can roll that into the schedules where we can look at what's going on with the levy, the excess levy capacity, the debt rate. So I think our debt in '25 is going to be up around 7% of the budget. We want to see what those numbers look like and just keep a handle on what we can fit in when, so that we get to town meeting and when we get to budgets, we don't have these this club is against that club, and I want to build this, and no, you shouldn't build that, and I want to build this, and what's it going to cost? We really want to have that mapped out. So we had a really good meeting on that. There's more to it. I don't think I need to go through all of that, Doug. But a wider group, we think the administration should drive it. We think Ways and Means, Capital Budget, and the other primary constituents need to be a part of those advisory committee meetings, and the product of those meetings is a living document of a draft of the 10-year plan, a version of which is actually published and always is in the Maytown meeting report. It was in the last one, you'll see it. But it would be a better document, and it would be sort of back mapped onto what we're looking at for debt schedules, for capacity for levy, and for what the rollout is looking like on the taxes. So that's in the middle, and we're hoping to have a meeting on that maybe early December to go through that in some detail and then have a presentation for the committee here. I don't think, you guys are there too, or maybe I've left some stuff out.
That's a good description.
Yeah, that's what we've done. And we're hoping to actually turn this into a document and meetings with content with the constituents that, you know, have an oar in this thing to be able to speak up. So that's where we're at. We also talked about the debt exclusion, and there's been a lot of action on that. Ed and John and Doug went to the select board and represented the sort of the levy capacity picture that you all saw at Ways and Means. They talked that through again. Maybe I'll let you cover that yourself, Doug, okay?
Sure.
All right, so there's action there, too.
Any questions about the capital plan side of it, just kind of where that's moving? Good. Okay, so
So I want to, can I say one thing? I think the need that we've all identified, which is kind of the elephant in the room, is that we need to get all the constituents in the same room to talk about priorities for capital planning. And a capital budgeting process is already well explored, and the state has a very detailed website with lots of reference material on how to approach the process. But if you don't get everyone to contribute to it on the same terms, then you have some authorities that have problems with what ends up on the schedule. And, this could go the other way. You could have everyone who has a problem with it at the same time. Hopefully that will relax to some state where everyone has some ownership and there's, a little mutually assured destruction. Everyone has a stake in forming the priorities. But in the end, we've got to put, Ways and Means has to justify what the debt service is and how it relates to the operational budget. So I think that we inevitably have a role, whether we like it or not, of referees of that process, at least at some point, when it arrives into the debt service and the yearly operational budget. And so I think we're stuck, but I think that we can play a constructive role in that. And hopefully we can cajole everyone to come together and have those meetings to set priorities. So that's how I'm thinking about it.
I think it's good that this meeting and this setting the priorities ahead of time. Usually by the time things get into the operational budget that we review, it's too late to do anything about it.
Yeah.
So go early.
early and often.
I don't know about often.
I think that'll replace pacing and spacing.
Right, early and often. Keep asking. You never know, they might pay for a field or something. So moving on, just the debt exclusion, we're at a point, last March we had a vote and voted to suggest that the town consider a debt exclusion in April for the Fox Hill and the police station. And so now we're moving on in that process, and it's to the select board, and they're the ones that vote. It's a 4/5 vote required to put it on the ballot. And so they asked us to attend Monday night. We did a presentation, answered questions. There were some thoughtful questions. They're certainly concerned about being able to sell it to the community. There's a lot of concern about people understanding and feeling like there was a bait and switch if they vote no on the debt exclusion and then the buildings are still built, then the residents are going to feel like they somehow got cheated and they voted no and they still, So there's definitely an education component there. There was a concern voiced by members of the select board wondering if they put it on the ballot, then who's going to go out there and fight the fight and sell it. And I certainly said we would help, but
I think
their
they
job.
said it was their job.
And
They were encouraged to be part of the process, I think is what happened. But everyone's part of the process.
Yeah.
So I thought we were going to talk about it here. Sounds like you've preempted that a bit by taking a plan to the select board.
The plan that was taken to the select board was the plan that we voted on March 13th of this year.
Okay.
We haven't had further discussion. There's really no significant change in
It
assumptions.
was literally a rerun of town meeting.
It's reiterating the plan.
Yeah, so, if you watch, the point was, we recommended back in March, we're following through with that. Still feel like that's a direction to go and an option.
Well, I don't.
And that's fine, yeah.
Anyway, but I didn't know if that's the discussion you want to have now. We know what we said back in May. And,
And we said it again in September.
right, we said at the town meeting.
Right, right. So I'm happy to have it. I'm not sure what has changed. I understand the concerns. I mean, if you want to share the
Well, I think that,
concern.
for me, the short version is a couple of things that you mentioned, that it's going to be hard to sell to the public because it's not an acute need. And I think that I would reconsider putting off the debt exclusion until the high school number was on the table and do it all at once, where the need would be crucial and important. And if it didn't pass, we still need the high school to be renovated. We still need our budget to be aligned with revenue and up to 2.5. And we would have to, take it to the voters again for the second attempt and better informed. But I just think that it's a little bit of a weak argument to say, it's like, oh, well, we've got this accounting thing we need to do, and we have to draw 5,000 people out of their houses to vote on something that they don't really understand. But I think the risk of failure on a non-essential vote is kind of significant. Other than it's a warm-up for later. Right?
Well, I'm not sure what the risk is, because
If you think you're going to have to do it twice, then maybe doing it sooner has some merit.
yeah.
Yeah, I understand your point. I think there's a couple things. One is, it actually put it very well, is that as opposed to most towns where they have a problem and then they have to solve it after the fact, we're asking you to take your vitamins and plan ahead. So the point of this is to get us in the mode of actually planning ahead. We're much like we planned ahead all along and are in a good financial position. We want to continue planning ahead and keep that levy headroom so that when the next PFAS surprise comes up or something, we don't all of a sudden say, oh my goodness, we're right up against Prop 2.5, we can't do anything. We have to go through a whole rigmarole just to have room in the budget to allow that to happen. So the point is, we don't want to have our credit cards maxed out. We want to pay them off and have some remaining credit so that when we do need to buy something, we can. And I think there's a lot to the point of it's good practice in that if the first time we try to do a debt exclusion is in the high school, we're probably going to learn a lot of things doing this for the first time in what has been more than 10 years since the last time the town tried to have a debt exclusion and failed. And then, so I think we're going to learn a lot from how to do it properly or how not to do it properly so that we can get the high school one right. So I think it would be a mistake to have the high school be the first time that, this generation has attempted to do a debt exclusion. But, yeah, I mean, it's obviously a lot of strategy.
It sounds a bit like a political choice, not an administrative function.
It's a financial choice. It's a good financial choice.
We have plenty of headroom.
Not depending on the assumptions. If you are optimistic about new growth, then yeah, we've got 12 years easily. If something goes south and you take that low 3-year average, we only got 6 years. So I guess the question is, what do you consider plenty of headroom?
Well, in a couple of years, we'll know what the high school's going to cost.
Yep. Look, there's no doubt that we need the exclusion for the high school.
The fast track on the high school, where that's been kind of accelerated dramatically, may be the biggest challenge for any debt exclusion, is it's coming fast. And so that might be a good reason not to do this, because it seemed like there was going to be a little more buffer there, and there may not be. I think that's going to present its own challenges.
When do we think the high school numbers are going to be?
They're they're talking about having numbers in September?
About a year.
A year? Coming to town meeting next September?
If I, without stepping on you too much,
No.
you know more about this than I do, but a way to put this is, based on all the analysis we've done, best case, worst case, you take any case you want, if the high school project comes in the $300 to $400 million area, spread over the whole life of banning it out, that will absolutely require a debt exclusion because it would push us right through our levy capacity. And that's what every town in the universe has done and will do. Even with MSBA assistance, they still get pushed into that because if you take 400 and 25% of it's paid for, you still got a $300 million bill. It's just not going to happen. So with that in mind, the high school, the sooner we get it on the table with a number and a plan that we think the town would back to build, the better off we are in figuring out how to float a debt exclusion and when to do it. And that project would be contingent on the passing of a debt exclusion. I just see no other, that's my opinion, I see no other way to do it. It would be contingent. Everything we've done so far isn't contingent on anything. It was simply, we figured out we could afford it with at least a 6-year runway, probably more like a 10-year runway. So why hamstring yourself with an open vote that's hard to explain for a debt exclusion that we really didn't need to build the buildings? We've done that. They're all approved. Bans are going to start rolling out over the next 12 months. We'll have the money to do it. But what some are considering, some people here on this committee, some people on the Selectmen's Committee are considering is it would be fiscally responsible, more responsible, to put the debt exclusion in place for those two projects so that we've got a lot of headroom, as much headroom as we've always enjoyed in the past. Right now we don't. We've got less. And why wouldn't you do that? It's free. It's absolutely free. There's no cost to it other than $30,000. It's not even that because it'll be on the April ballot. So the logic is financially, it's you're crazy not to do it. Politically is a whole different story, and you get into all these things about getting it twice, getting people to understand it. Why don't we just wait for the high school? And I don't think Ways and Means should be in the business of even trying to figure that out. Personally, that's the selectmen's job, and the selectmen is the approving authority to put it on the ballot. We're simply giving them the information that if you get it, this is what it does for you. If you don't get it, this is what your runway looks like and where you'll be. And we're more than predicting, we're almost guaranteeing you're not going to build a high school without a debt exclusion. Figure it out.
And there's no guarantee that the selectmen are even going to approve
This time. That's
to put
right.
it on the...
Yeah, they're thinking hard about this. You know, I would say that's why we're going back for a third time. They've asked the administration to draft the language for what it would look like before they'll even finish their deliberation. It's a difficult decision for them. So I'm not going to second guess where that'll go. It would require a 4 to 5 vote minimum to get on the ballot. Yeah. And they may or may not get it. So I appreciate what you're saying, Roger. You know, it's a little dicey politically, and it may not be worth the risk. On the other hand, it's educational. If you get it right, it's fiscally, it's responsible. There's almost no reason not to do it financially. There isn't any, actually. Why in the world would you not do this from a fiscal point of view?
Right? I see all the pros and cons.
Yeah, so that's really
I think you've got to make a good point about
Yeah.
this. It's not really our decision,
No, it's not at all. Yeah.
but except the aspect of it is that we do think we collectively, maybe I'm presuming too much, do believe that we do need to build a high school. We need to figure out how to responsibly fund it. In
That one's pretty
reasonable
easy.
timeframe.
You have to pass a debt exclusion. Yeah, that one's pretty simple.
SBA to agree to it.
That would be
Right.
helpful, sure.
You know, I mean, even if we pass it, we get all the estimates, and we all decide this is what we're going to do, and let's put on a debt exclusion. I mean, we've been turned down.
I I don't think they're expecting to get MSBA participation.
Yeah, they're out of the picture.
Not in these timeframes. We're talking though, a few years here. If you were talking 5+ years and, the Fox Hill was closed out and we're rolling along and the building's that much older, you might have it's a different landscape for SBA. The landscape right now in the short term is we're highly unlikely, we're filing again, but we're highly unlikely to get any support from the state if we tried to go ahead in the next 2 to 3 years. This is my opinion, but I've got a lot of information.
Common wisdom, I think.
Yeah.
Sure, please.
I just want to say that I think both of those things are true at the same time, that there are reasons not to do it, and I would put a little more nuance on there's no reason not to do it. I think that there is going to be an argument that this is a license to raise our taxes, therefore no. And you're going to have a no position that's not going to be moved. And I think there's good reason to proceed as if we do want to do this, even if the select board decides not to do it, even if they decide to do it and it gets voted down, because I think we have a couple more steps to take in offering a good explanation. And the only way past the I never want to give you license to raise my taxes if I don't have to argument is to build trust that we have a really solid track record of keeping the taxes as low as possible while being responsible and making the investments that the town needs. And I think we need to explain that part. And then I also think we need to explain why we want it as an accounting tool. And it's not so that we can raise your taxes, and just extend that curve forevermore. It's that local to a particular year, there may be a reason why we want to spend more, not with the anticipation of continuing to spend more, but because we need a PFAS plan. And maybe the next year, we won't need that, and we'll raise taxes less, or we'll get a grant, and it'll cover some of that, and we can raise taxes less. We want to be able to deal with these local, one-year things that happen, and that is a nuanced education that has to happen about how we do business and how we try to responsibly spend the taxpayers' dollars. And I think all of that has to be really well thought out, and it's going to take a year or two before we're ready to convince people of this high school project. And every time I hear the number, it's another $100 million. So yeah, if we're talking about $400 million, what's bundling in the $110 million exclusion that we're talking about now? With that, at some point it gets really huge, and I don't know how that's going to play. But I think the argument that we can offer of how we do business and how we're being responsible is paramount, and we should force ourselves to keep discussing it.
I think to get too far off the topic, but the fact that taxes go up every year has very little to do with Ways and Means.
Oh, yeah. Oh, absolutely.
A lot to do with the sensitivity to the residents' desire for services and their dislike for taxes and the electability of the select board.
Right.
Because we do set a estimated tax goal for the year, and it's consistently been going up because we're more or less holding to a stable services target. And with inflation and everything else going on, the rates are they're forced to go up because we're not being really sensitive to the tax averse residents. And we have a lot of non-averse tax residents.
I agree, we have both, but I would also say we have to firmly ground ourselves in the facts, which is that we've never done an exclusion or an override of 2.5. And Prop 2.5 forces us not to raise the taxes by more than 2.5% plus our growth rate. And 2.5% is about the inflation, and the growth rate is about the expansion of the town, which needs more services. So if the town grows by 10%, it makes sense that we need 10% more services delivered. And so I'm not sure that there's a validity in the argument that we've been overspending in any area. It's actually been just about what you would expect.
So you think our growth has been completely covered by, sorry, the budget growth has been completely covered by the growth, new building growth rate in town?
Plus inflation. Our total growth rate has, the growth rate in our spending, to my calculations, and I'll revisit it, has been 0.2% less averaged over the last 20 years than the rate of full CPI inflation plus the growth rate of the town.
But then we shouldn't be getting closer to our Prop 2.5 limit.
Inflation's over 2.5 is the issue.
Yes, that's
And we just whacked on a chunk of debt.
Yeah, Prop 2.5 is not inflation adjusted is the issue, so average inflation is over 2.5, you're inherently going to exceed it.
All right.
But our excess levy capacity has been growing, and that took a hit when we decided to build 2 buildings, and it'll take an even bigger hit for the high school.
All right, sorry to diverge too far off of the original discussion.
It's a big discussion, and, yeah,
It's exactly relevant.
right. And to some degree, I think our job is to say, this is what we think is healthiest, and then there is a political component of it, and that's the select board's job to say, we don't think this is the smart time to do it, because it may affect other things. So, so a couple of more things here. We'll try to speed through them or put them off one more time, because we keep putting them off because the meetings run long. That's probably my fault. So the first thing, just as we start to ramp up for the budget year next year, I got some feedback during the budget time, just I asked, and then in my own kind of thoughts about it. And it feels like for me, every year as we're going through the budget, in my mind, I think we should do this differently next year. And then it kind of, everything happens, and then all of a sudden it's time to do the budget again. So I'm looking for feedback of things that you would like to see that would make our process in reviewing the budgets, the departmental budgets, the capital request, better. And I'll just give you a list of a few things to think about, and then if you want to just send me any suggestions, and I think it's something more that we may just, if we kind of agree, pass on to the administration. So one we had talked about last year is just to make sure that we have a presentation of the budget guidelines to the full committee prior to starting the budget process in March. A couple of years that seems to have not happened as much, and that maybe we'd like to have a little more input, and that it might be a little closer to the budget summit, that they talk about those guidelines, and that maybe they present the options, and that it doesn't just come in as this is what's been decided. And if we want to have, I guess my question to you is, do we want to have more input in what those guidelines are? Do we want to give some suggestions that we'd like to see more conservative budgeting, or we would like to, as we look at the assumptions for the debt schedule? And so looking for input for how involved, or do we want to be historically, how involved were we? I've heard some members of the committee say, well, we used to do it in November, and we had a lot more say. Right after COVID, we had almost no say.
We used to vote on it in Ways and Means. We'd say, we'd have that budget summit, and Ways and Means would be there, and we'd be stating our opinion along with the school committee in town. And then we'd come back to the Ways and Means meeting saying, here's kind of where we sounded like we ended up, and Ways and Means would take a vote on that. So we were trying to, set it a little bit and make sure we were comfortable with it. So it was a little more involved back then.
And was that out of necessity because the town was in a different place, or maybe run a little differently, or was that?
People were concerned about keeping that number low. That's what it was. I mean, we would come in, the town manager and the town accountant would come in and they'd say, here's like different scenarios if we raise the budget guideline by this amount. Here's how it kind of goes down through to the bottom line, and we'd have like 3 or 4 scenarios, and we'd kind of talk about them, and there were assumptions built in on how much revenue we were going to get. So we were kind of trying to look at those scenarios and then pick something that we felt kind of comfortable with.
So as I recall, the Ways and Means was invited to the budget summit,
Right.
more as an observer than as a participant, which is a distinction. And then I don't think there was any sort of more communication before the beginning of the presentations in January. It might be useful to know, so every year there's the budget summit, and then the town administrator writes a memo to all the departments saying, here's the target. Ways and Means hearing about that, and the tenor and of the tone of the letter might be interesting before it was sent out, but I don't know that we have any kind of real reason to sort of intervene in the middle of that process.
Okay.
So that's different than I remember. Maybe I'm remembering before you're remembering how it used to happen.
I mean, there was also a time at which they would present budget alternatives, but it was sort of after they'd already decided how it would play out.
I think our leverage was we could be a part of that discussion actively because we have to approve the budgets.
Well, yeah, maybe I'm thinking a different set. At one point, there was a set where, since we set a guideline, but it isn't until September, November that the tax rate gets set. And when the tax rate gets set, the selectmen get a little bit of a menu of, here's how we could split it between commercial and residential, and by setting particular tax rates. And what we got at the beginning of the budget season was a little bit of a preview of what that spread might look like.
Yeah, I mean, the select board's doing that in the middle of the fiscal year, though, so because that's when they're saying the actual rate, finalizing.
Right, that's after the...
So it's halfway into the year already at that point.
It is, right. Because that's after the budget's been approved. I mean, the selectmen, we vote on the budget, and then they figure out how to spread it across the taxpayers.
Right.
I'm not sure I know what actually helps the process move forward more smoothly, or what helps inform better restraint in terms of things. The union contracts usually are pretty non-negotiable, and they're 89 and then 85% of the budget. So, and it also depends on whether we're in a school contract year or where the different contracts are in terms of whether are they being renegotiated and how much is built in. So, I don't know how to help the process along.
Yeah, thank you. I guess, I mean, the fundamental question is, have we been generally happy with what the guidelines have been, or do we feel we need to be inserted because the numbers should be higher or lower than what we've been getting, right? I mean, if we're happy with the outcome for the last few years, then, why make waves, so to speak? But, so I guess that's the real question is, are we happy with the result or not?
I think it would be helpful to us to be able to have more awareness year to year, like see, over the last 10 years, what the budget guideline's been. So then you could look at it and say, wow, it's crept up quite a bit, or it had a little, tick up and then came down because of XYZ reason, or, because every year it seems like we get a number before us, and I'm kind of like, well, what was it last year?
So it's a way of forcing us to pay more attention.
Well, and also push back if we feel like, hey, this thing is going like this, and it should be going like that.
I think the last 10 years are in the budget, toward the end of it. There's a retrospective on budget amounts and growth and other things.
Yeah.
Last 10 years of budgets or actuals?
Well, they're roughly the same.
The budget guideline, we give a guideline that says each budget in the town on average is pre-approved to go up 4%. Or
Across the board.
3%. Across the board, but it's all pulled together, like for all the budgets that Paul Sagarino was responsible for. Some may go up more, some may go up less. As a whole, they all have to come into this, at this number. So that's the
And then
budget
the
guide.
schools get a agreement. So the budget summit is kind of a meeting between the town administration, the school administration, and they kind of divvy up, all right, this is what we're going to, for a long time, the schools would get a little more of an increase, and there was kind of a blended increase. The last couple of years, it's
That
been a
gets
little more.
debated at that summit
Yeah.
meeting. In Ways and Means, typically, the chair should be at that meeting, and I see no reason at all, if you see something that you think needs to be dealt with or talked about more, that's the place to bring it up. An example would be if we feel like, the debt service in the fiscal year is going to hit 8%. You could say, we need to buy more of that down, because that's just jacking up our base, as an example, right? And the school department definitely, brings up their concerns about bus costs, out-of-district costs. I mean, there's a whole bunch of stuff that needs to get heard before you agree on, this is the model we're going to go with, 4.5%.
Right.
And a split with schools or no split. Last year, there was no split, I don't think. But anyway, that's the meeting to do that. And yeah, a lot's been determined, but it hasn't been brought forward to this committee or to anybody to say, okay, start building your budgets. It's the output of that comes here, typically. And you're right, the past few years, they just came and said, this is what it is. And what you're definitely saying is, it would be nice if you brought to us the recommendation and we actually debate it and vote as a committee, with the chair and maybe vice chair having already participated in the summit. And then the committee gets to say, yep, okay, we're going to drive all the departments on whole, on average, to that number. That's the process you're talking about right there. I think as a minimum is a better way to do it. I don't think we should try to build for the administration on a department-by-department basis.
No.
Budget. That's
No,
just
not-
not reasonable.
No. Yeah, that wasn't the,
And for the record, salary drives 80% of this thing right off the bat.
Sure.
So there's not a whole lot of wiggle room left here.
right. So another, one of the other things that I guess I'd like to hear your thoughts on, I would like to see, it seems like when I first came on this committee that department heads did much more of the presenting of their budget, and I think over time we've evolved to the subcommittee chair presenting the budget for the department head, and the department head smiling and saying, I have nothing to add. And it almost feels like you're a cheerleader for them and you're trying to get your team to score. And so I would like to suggest that we ask the department heads to present the budget, and that the subcommittee chair may discuss, they may go through what the discussions in the subcommittee were, any concerns or questions, and the resolution of that. But I'd like to put that responsibility back on the department heads. I also think that, not that we necessarily have the ability to do that, but that was also the way in town meeting. where my memory is the department heads presented their budget. But I know we do the whole thing. That seems to work pretty well, but maybe if they had a little more presentation here and had to have a little more.
Yeah, I agree 100%. I mean, we've seen problems in the fire department. We've almost had to send the department back, like, where'd this number come from?
Yeah,
You know, that's just nuts.
Yeah, I think you're correct. There is a little bit of Stockholm syndrome where you do feel like you need to support the budget. So yeah, I think reversing the order to presentations where department head goes first and then Ways and Means sub can add their extra thoughts is exactly the right idea.
I mean, the department heads already have to write a cover letter for their budget. So we should have all read that, so.
Sure. Yeah.
And even some of those have gotten not as good. So I would agree with you. My 2 cents, let's get it back to.
Flip it the other way.
Yeah, let's get the horse in front of the cart here.
There was another change we tried last year, and I'm trying to remember what it was. Maybe it was talking about budgets and warrants in the same meeting, or there was something that didn't go
Yeah.
super smoothly.
That was a failed experiment.
Yeah.
It was a trial to keep them from having to come back. We kind of reviewed the department budget and then their warrant request.
Yeah.
And that one.
What was it, just too much content or something? I'm trying
Well,
to remember what the issue was.
Reason to do it is presumably because we thought we would disprove or vote against one budget because of the totals not adding up to however much we wanted to spend, or that we wanted to have some influence on the prioritization of things across departments. I think that's one of the reasons we didn't vote them
what?
early, right? A couple of times we review them and we say, well, we're not going to vote it because of.
Oh, that's a separate thing.
Yeah,
That's holding the vote. Did we hold the vote?
The experiment
also?
was to make it so the departments only had to come in once instead of
Yeah,
twice.
yeah.
The failure was that the capital warrant articles aren't determined yet, so it was really too early. So I admit it was, fun to try, but big mistake. We shouldn't do that.
That was your mistake?
That was mine. I admit it.
But on the other hand, some of them are, like the school department, because of the way they do their budget, their warrant articles actually can be available, can be ready.
Yeah, that one worked out.
Ahead of everything else.
Yeah.
That's not true for all departments.
Yeah.
But it did seem, it's also that you're voting on some of them so much earlier than others.
Yeah.
And it felt like we were getting tougher toward the, and the very first ones we heard 8 weeks earlier, we're like, oh, okay. And so maybe the warrant articles altogether.
Can I ask a question? So if comp and benefits is 80%, so you're talking the remaining 20% goes across all these different departments. So you're saying that we're like approving these one meal piece off one at a time? Like, is there any kind of compilation of everybody's departmental budget so we can sort of look at it in total and then sort of?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Beforehand, you'll have a complete list of every department's request and what increase it is and what the total adds up to. So you have the big picture before you
By
do each one.
department. You'll see consulting, you'll see expenses.
Yep.
You'll see salaries, you'll see, travel, whatever. That's all there in one big chunk. My only point was the 4.5% that we kind of face lately is really driven predominantly by salaries and the cost of living.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, Prop 2.5 in many ways is way out of date with what that driver does to you. So what you're doing is you're fighting a losing battle against Prop 2.5 sooner or later.
So there's one caveat. So Paul Sagarino says, I have my group of budgets that the department heads report to me. I promise they're all going to come in at the guideline. So don't be worried if one's a little high, one's a little low. But there are other budgets that aren't under him, like library and some of these other ones. Rec.
Board of Health, RAG,
Okay,
Board of
right.
Health.
Those are independent, so
Right.
we do need to watch those, because if
Right.
those come up over the guideline, you got to go, hey, wait a minute, you're supposed to stay at the guideline.
Yeah, I think everybody does make an attempt to hit the guideline, and except if there's something really, some extra out of cycle need. The overall budget, there is a scorecard front and back that has all the departments and all the accommodated accounts and everything. Some of those numbers come in kind of late, but you keep track of everything in the whole budget. There's a separate piece of paper that Paul or John produces, or actually the accountant, the budget chief, who is now, anyway, so.
And then the only other thing I would say, and a couple of people have mentioned this, Mike, you might have, I can't remember, somebody mentioned it during the process, that it would be nice to ask the department heads to, when they come in for their budget or for warrant requests, to review the things they got capital money for last year, what's completed and what's still outstanding. My example, for some reason, it keeps sticking in my head, is that, I don't know, 2-3 years ago, we agreed to buy bleachers for the brush field, and we still don't have bleachers. And
We could get that on the cover sheet.
We did.
What are your outstanding?
Yeah.
That could go on the cover.
Right, and I think the big ones, the school's probably the biggest. Most of the town ones are buy a dump truck, or, and those kind of come through, but.
Actually, it's not buy a dump truck, it's buy 8 new vehicles.
Yeah,
$500,000.
Right.
But old warrants that aren't executed, that could be a category on the cover sheet.
Yep.
Just list them.
And, yeah.
I mean, that data is readily available to them. SAGs in the purchasing office have got that stuff at their fingertips.
I think that's a good idea. The one thing I think we want to be careful about is by driving that too hard, I think in the past there's been some warrant articles where they've had second thoughts, and we don't want to drive people to spend money so that they don't have to explain why they didn't spend the money.
No, I'll pat them on the back a bit.
That one comes to mind.
Yeah.
The status of old warrants, that's what it is. The status of any unclosed warrants, that's it.
So while Frank's advocating for the budget overview worksheet, I'd like to request that we try to get department heads to fill that out, because sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. And there were some categories on there that if they had actually looked at it and filled it out, I know I wouldn't have got tricked on a couple of things.
Yeah.
So
And the subcommittee should drive that with their department.
yeah, and I think Sagarino should emphasize that. But yeah, the subcommittee needs to make sure they're filled out.
Okay. All right. And I think that Deb's questions flow right into our next topic, which is Ed's new member guide.
They do.
Take one and pass that down.
Thanks. We're sent around. I hope nothing on this is surprising as kind of important to what we are and how we operate. But I wanted to codify, what you should know and just put it in one place. And I think we need to do some thinking about how we present it and how much goes in here. One challenge and opportunity is that all of this is written down. There is, stuff on the state website that covers all of this, but it's all kind of disjoint and in many documents. So I think we need to kind of outline it and reference off, have web links. And I think a good format for this might be whether it's a document or a page on our Ways and Means site that we all use to store all the budget summaries as we go through them. And this would be just a good reference for all of this stuff. So as you see, the kind of legal basis for us in the bylaws and our other obligations, which I'm sure I can speak with the clerk for all the relevant recent references for open meeting law and conflict of interest, which we're all supposed to look at when we renew our terms. And then a financial overview of how we do the yearly budgets. That's kind of the process that we're going through now, and I think this was a really good exercise, which I mentioned in Section 7 later for, which is kind of new. I stuck it in there for discussion because I think that we probably ought to write down our aspiration to review the process at the end, kind of off-cycle, and see if there's anything that we want to improve for next year. The tools and resources is just so that we all know where to find things we would call. Meetings and procedures, we should write down how we conduct our meetings. I think, I mentioned Robert's rules, which we sort of keep ourselves to very, very loosely. But in the event that, we see some disorder, we'll have to have a framework. And how we collaborate with other committees. I think it's important to at least show the structure. I have, cobbled together lots of other references, and the one I want to mention is the budget book that the administration prepares with some of our input every year, which covers lots of this stuff very well. And we should probably create a short multiple choice quiz for town meeting to make sure that they take a look at it, because I think it'd be very instructive and helpful. Or at least, emphasize that this is something that we should be prepared as town meeting members with. But I think that we should put all those together and make sure we have all of our prior budgets and reference materials all in one place. I think this just might be the framework that kind of defines that structure. As far as how to flesh this out and firm it up, I would welcome any volunteers to go through this and go through some of the references that I've cobbled together and pick out what you think is most important, what you think might have been missing, things that may have been not understandable. For newer members, what is troubling you for in terms of things that are just difficult to figure out in the first instance.
Maybe a glossary.
Right, and yeah, that's Appendix A, which got cut off for consideration tonight. And the glossary that is in that budget book at the end is actually pretty good to start, and I think that we could elaborate for our purposes a bit in defining the different kinds of accounts, for example, and how they relate to the budget and how they all tie together. So there's a few more technical things that we should probably know to supplement that. But we've got a pretty good basis for all of this material already somewhere. We just want to make it digestible. So I have called and discussed with more than half of the committee what you feel is important for this kind of guide, and I have to get in touch with the rest of you, so I'll send out some emails if I haven't spoken with you. But I just want to make sure I touch base and everyone gets an opportunity to have a voice. And then I'll probably ask you to, or at least review some things and point out, what I should bake in here, what maybe is just too much.
Anything with that? Deb,
Looks good.
Take notes as you go through as the newest person.
I
What
can
would be
certainly be your guinea pig as I'm
Yeah.
trying to figure this whole.
Yeah, especially as we go through in the spring, the budget.
Yeah.
What would have been nice to...
Well, even like just the, the committee dynamics and collaboration, like, I'm not familiar with all the players and
Sure.
and the relationships and things like that, so I find that would be sort of helpful, especially going into that budget process, especially since it's so important. So, yeah.
You haven't been through a full cycle yet either, right? So that's extremely instructive, but you're right, it would help to have a little forethought about what's this about, and then see it in action. I think it'll help you a lot. It takes a little while to figure out what's going on in Ways and Means, but it's not difficult. It's just there's a lot of pieces.
Right.
and I think you mentioned when I spoke with you that we tend to learn by the Suzuki method, right? You just pick up the instrument and play. Just be part of the process, and you'll pick it up, which is okay. But I think
We can do better.
Be nice to have something to refer to.
yeah, there's some strife and not
Yeah.
knowing what's going on, which I certainly had for the first couple of years. So yeah, I'd be happy to.
Yeah,
talk with you about that.
I'm not negative on this. I just don't want you to be too terrified, okay? You will get the hang of it, and this is something that could help you,
Yeah.
help you a lot.
Yeah. Yeah, so we'll flesh it out, and then we'll boil it down to something that's less scary than it could be.
Functional. All right. I got out of order on the agenda more because I had notes for the things I was going to talk about, and I didn't make little notes to turn it over to Ed. So I think now we're just to the reports from any committees that we have representatives on. If anything has happened or is new, police?
There was actually a meeting today that I did not attend, so I'll catch up on that.
Okay.
I can give the short version.
Okay.
They primarily reviewed the design plan for the temporary facilities in the Vinebrook building. They're going to put all the officers they're going to build offices on the first floor, put a few things, but no people in the basement, restripe the ground and some. They're not going to add any macadam, but they're going to make parking places for 63 people. The other thing they talked about was the OPM, the owner's project manager was on board, and he brought out his standard, here's the budget, here's where we are against the budget, here's where we're going, what's changed. And they had some minor updates to the schedule where they expect to be building, to get the temporary building out to bid by January or February. They expect to have it built and completed by June and start moving into it in June and July. And so in August next year, they can start demolition. There was no update on the design of the new building or the site plan or anything, but it's moving forward on the temporary facility post haste.
If I may, Mr. Chairman, is there any update on the estimated cost? There's no bids have gone out.
They have not bid it. They are holding to the original cost structure that they laid out to begin with when they, for the vote.
Yeah.
So there's still.
I have this naive hope that some of these bids will come in 5% lower, but we'll see.
Yeah, I mean, there were things that the OPM thought, it's like, well, we bid $2 million for the temporary facility, and at the moment, it looks like it might be less.
All right.
So there's some things where they made really rough estimates,
Yeah.
but it hasn't gone far enough to actually refine the numbers yet.
That'll all come into play when we start to figure out what to buy down with free cash and how much money's got to be spent up front.
Right.
Right.
I'll give you a quick, the high school, they have monthly meetings. They're moving along in the design process. I think they had maybe 9 to 12 options or something. It was
9. They're whittling them down.
might have been 14. They removed, the committee voted to remove maybe 5 or 6 already. That just didn't seem reasonable or practical. I think it's still a broad number of options that include keeping a majority of the existing building, a little bit of new build. I mean, there is one that's just only refurbishing the old building. Then there's build some and tear down some and keep a big part of the building, all the way to building a brand-new high school on the football field or building a brand-new high school on the existing student parking lot area. The problems that I see with those is, one, even in their cost estimates, they're not talking about demolishing anything. They're just talking about leaving it. And they said, oh, the town could use it for whatever they wanted.
Senior center.
Yeah.
Rolling out.
Right.
I've got my favorites.
Indoor track.
Yeah, and a couple, and in those, they don't really do anything, there's a couple where they don't really acknowledge the need, that we still have ownership of space for BCAT, space for the science centers. We got to figure out what we would do with the school administration and so forth. So that's coming along. They're making good progress there. So that's kind of the discussions right now.
There is a website, and the presentations are on the website,
Yes, there is a website.
and there's BCAT videos on YouTube.
Yeah. Fox Hill?
They're in the middle of detailed design. The meetings have been very minimal, mostly to approve invoices and approve some money to do some more ground testing. That's about it. Oh, there's on the solar panels, there was a fairly comprehensive report that was out a month or two ago. There's currently a report in production for a contract to do a PPA, a purchase power agreement, where the school system basically says to some other company, here, have our roof. You own the power, you own the solar panels, you give us the power, we get some credits, I forget which way the money flows. I think that one, it isn't in yet, there'll be a meeting in the next week, I guess, about it, and it's just to review it. And I think to me, the discussion is, if we fully own it and control it, then we get all the benefits from the power rebates till the end of time. In the PPA, we don't have to put up any capital, but we don't get to reap as much benefit. And if we were to pay for the town of Burlington wanted to pay for the solar panels, there's no money currently allocated for that. So either it's, I don't know if it is even reasonable to think that it comes out of the current contingency funds that's in the contract, or whether, we actually have to propose that it's a separate warrant article to fund it, or, pay cash for it. But it's not a urgent need, because I think to figure it out. But I'm kind of keen, I think, to figure out how to keep the operational costs in the long term down. But to do that, you have to put in money, capital up front.
But I did do a first pass calculation of the most expensive option, and the debt payments were substantially less than the rebates and grants we got.
Right.
So it would be a moneymaker
It's a moneymaker.
if we do it right.
And is that something that you feel like the committee is going to approach it looking at it in that way, or should they get pressure from Ways and Means to look at it that way?
I think we need to push on them a little bit. At the moment, they're not motivated one way or the other.
Okay.
I think, Bob himself, I think he's when I asked him about it, he said, I'm cheap, so he kind of wants somebody else to put up the capital. But I think he's not really thinking about the operational costs as much as capital costs. And capital numbers are really big, so.
Yeah, I think the guidance they need is on the big picture. They're afraid to ask for more money because they're asking for a lot for the building. But it's an investment I would make because it would pay returns. It's just our capacity to make the bond is the only friction. After that, it's a moneymaker.
How much is, how much you,
3.8, is it the most?
3 million or 3.5 million for the total, because it's a plug-and-play system for giving us the capital.
And that's the big one. So that's the
Yeah.
panels on canopies in the parking lot as well as on top of it.
I think, in the event that they come in, a little under budget because there is a little margin in there, I think there's going to be a big, rush for how to spend that money. I would suggest it would be in the spirit of the, wanting to build a building, that the money should go to something building related, like the solar, as opposed to let's put another field in, which I'm sure is one of the other contingencies that will be there. So
There's no room for another field.
They'll still want it. They'll want a double-decker field. But anyway, I would emphasize that solar is actually more in line with what we allocate money for as opposed to these other nice-to-haves.
I think that politically, I feel I'm ready to give an argument that this is a really good use of that excess capital. So if it makes more financial sense to invest that excess cash, I think we need to give them license that we're going to go to town meeting and say they're actually making money with this last bit of spend. Right?
Athletic fields.
Fields. There was a meeting October 15th. Right now, they're just trying to prioritize some of the action items. Those being the walkway, ADA ramp, the lighting, the fencing, the seating. Their budget, $4.7 million. The next meeting on the 13th, they're going to take a vote and determine which of those items kind of prioritize those items within their budget before they go out to bid.
So they're not going to get all of them?
No, that's why it's, they've got to figure out, what the priorities are.
It's not really what they presented at the town meeting.
Let's not go back to that mess.
I'm confused. In the warrant article, there was a specific list of things that they were going to do with the money. Are they not planning to do those things?
That I don't know. I wasn't at the town meeting, so I can't speak to that.
Well, but I'm just confused why there's even a priority discussion going on. Either they're doing what's in the article or a subset of it because all of a sudden it's more expensive.
It was as amended, right?
Is there some other choice? But there, as amended, there was a specific set of things they were supposed to do. I think we want to understand what discussion they're even having.
I suspect that what they wanted to do was too expensive, and they're not going to.
Well, they talked about parking, for example.
Well, that's why I want to understand
fencing.
it. Are they trying to do something else, or are they saying that what they already plan to do is too expensive?
Well, they're trying to prioritize whatever they, the items that they want to, they have a budget, right, for the fields, and I think they're trying to prioritize in terms of parking, fencing, ADA ramps, bleachers, right? There's a number of items that folks are discussing.
I'm still confused. Why do you have to prioritize unless you ran over budget?
So, well, they don't know that they're running over budget. But when you put out something to bid, if you don't identify something as an option that can be priced separately, then when the whole thing costs too much, you don't have anywhere to pare it back.
Okay,
Without starting over.
They're preparing for potentially being over budget?
Before they put everything out to bid, they want to make sure they're within their budget. So I think they're prioritizing those particular items so that there's not a cost overrun.
Okay.
And that's what the discussion is at the next meeting on the 13th.
Yeah. Is this same committee that you're talking with, is this the one that's eventually going to try to do the whole, let's prioritize the fields between rec and schools and figure out what we want to do when? Or is that going to be a different?
No, that's different.
This is specific to just this one field?
Just this one, right.
Do you have any sense of when the big picture thing's going to happen?
I don't. I think that the rec department, I haven't heard that they've gotten their final version of their facilities master plan study. It was supposed to be maybe in October, November, I believe, is what they told us. So I'm not sure that that's in yet. And go ahead.
Sorry, are we on to the next?
Yes.
We didn't, not on your list was the committee put together to decide on voting buttons.
Oh, that's a brand new one, right?
And was Cheyenne on that committee, or who did you pick?
I don't think I picked anybody.
Oh,
I don't think I picked any.
Which committee? Didn't hear you.
The voting, the
town meeting voted
Electronic voting.
to
Oh, yeah.
come up, look into the electronic voting.
and I haven't been asked about it, so
Oh, Bill has to get on.
I have one volunteer.
Yeah, two. I think I volunteered and I thought Cheyenne.
Oh, and Cheyenne did, but he also volunteered for the other, so you're appointed.
Well,
And I mean, it was specified that a decision will be made at some particular date in January, is that correct?
Yes, it was a
Should be in the
short,
minutes.
Probably need to have a committee.
It's in the
to
near
make a
term.
decision.
short term.
They better get going. You're behind, Roger.
Sorry.
Well, we were doing the research on the floor of town meeting, because there's one company that's done this for something like 73 towns in Massachusetts, so there are lots of bids that are publicly available to compare to. So, I do think you can make quick work of this.
I don't think it's moved forward. I'll reply, thank you.
and then another stray question. I realize I'm a little off script here, but the new sign at the corner that was approved for the town for everything, what budget is that coming out?
ARPA. ARPA.
Our budget?
No, ARPA.
Oh, ARPA. ARPA.
I learned that in the bus. I didn't know that, but I saw it in the bus that it's coming from.
Yeah, they've got this little slush fund that they kind of use for things. Anyway, sorry.
That's all right. Anything else?
The minutes.
Oh, thank you.
Move to approve?
We had a couple of changes that were submitted by John and Ed. John caught a doctor. We missed a couple of zeros.
Oh, you got it.
Yeah, Fox Hill's only 1 million. I'm done, Roger.
All right.
Yeah, it turns out it looks like we only approved $1 million for Fox Hill instead of $100 million. So John
Roger's
caught that and fixed it. And Ed, you made a change.
Yeah, so I believe I corrected description of what happened with the Fox Hill committee. And in July, there's a very diffuse description about it going to the state, which might have been my fault because I reported it. But what I changed that to is that I reported that the preferred schematic design would be reviewed by the MSBA ahead of the funding request in September. Maybe, Roger, you could confirm that the preferred schematic design, I believe, was submitted in July,
Yes.
end of July, just after this meeting.
Yeah.
Awesome.
I don't remember the exact date of that submission.
And then on the September minutes, I enhanced the description of the solar panel project and said that the solar panels will be considered as a separate project. The building will be built to support photovoltaics, but the implications of their implementation will be analyzed separately.
Say that again, the implication.
Of their financial implications of their implementation will be analyzed separately. So add a financial so that it actually relates to us.
All right.
Motion to approve July and September
As amended.
as amended.
Oh, I'm sorry, Paul.
That's all right. Can we just get my name changed?
We got it. That was John's other connect. That was John's, sorry.
I thought it was a good name change, but
Paul Newman, that's a pretty good name.
after
Got some history.
I hear
Yeah, you do tomato sauce or salad?
we should probably do one at a time because people see it.
Oh, yeah, you're right. All right, motion to approve July's first, right? July,
All in favor?
Aye.
as amended.
As amended. Opposed? Abstain? Beautiful. Now, motion for September?
Motion to approve September's amended.
Second. All in favor? Opposed? Abstain?
I guess we could have done it again. I wasted time.
Ready?
Yeah.